"Take it off," the judge said, his voice as thin and white as a razor blade. He didn't look at the man's face. He looked at the splash of color on his chest, a flicker of gold and blue against a dark suit, and saw it as an infection in the sterile authority of his courtroom. This is a house of law, not a parade ground. There is no place for military theatrics here. He was speaking to a 72-year-old black man who had walked through fire for the flag that stood just to the judge's right. But the words were meant to strip him of more than just a medal. They were meant to strip him of history, of value, of his very presence. This wasn't about courtroom decorum. This was an exorcism. And in that moment, a decorated American hero was about to be rendered invisible by the very system he had sworn to defend. What gives a man the audacity to humiliate a legend in open court? And what happens when the silent brotherhood he belongs to finds out? That question makes your blood run cold. Do me a favor. Hit that like button, share your outrage in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that refuse to let the truth be silenced. Now let's go back to that room where a quiet man's dignity was about to go to war with a loud man's prejudice. The courtroom had fallen into that dead-heavy quiet that precedes a storm. When the oak doors at the back swung open, Elias Thorne entered not with a stride, but with a presence. 72 years old, with a spine as straight as the day he enlisted 50 years prior. His charcoal suit was immaculate, a simple frame for the man inside. There was no bluster in his walk, no challenge in his gaze, but on the lapel of his jacket, pinned directly over his heart, was the Distinguished Service Cross. It wasn't large, but it held the light, a small defiant star in the dim room. He moved toward the witness stand, his focus singular. He didn't scan the gallery or acknowledge the scattered whispers that followed him, like dust motes in a sunbeam. Some in the pews leaned forward, intrigued. Others, mostly white faces in pressed shirts, exchanged almost imperceptible smirks. They didn't know who he was, and in their world, that meant he was nobody. Presiding over it all was Judge Alastair Finch, a man in his late 50s whose family had been fixtures in Alabama for generations. He sat elevated on his bench, a position that he felt was not just judicial, but natural. He saw the law not as a scale to weigh justice, but as a hammer to enforce order, his order. His eyes the color of sour milk, fixed on the metal. That's when he spoke, the words cutting through the silence with a brittle snap. "Take it off." The court clerk, a young woman barely out of law school, flinched. I beg your pardon." "Your Honor." Judge Finch didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He leaned into his microphone, his gaze never leaving Elias. "I will not repeat myself. Remove the decoration. It is an improper display in my courtroom." The air thickened. The implication was clear, hanging there for everyone to see. "Your honors don't count here. Your service is irrelevant." In the second row, a young prosecutor with a smug face fought back a grin. From the back, a man coughed, but the sound was shaped too much like a laugh. Elias Thorne did not move. For a full 10 seconds, he stood as still as a monument, his dark eyes locked on the judge. He was a man who had faced down enemy fire, who had held dying soldiers in his arms, who had learned that the most powerful weapon in any conflict was control. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for the pin on his lapel. His hand, weathered by time and hardship, trembled slightly. It wasn't the tremor of age or fear. It was the vibration of pure, unadulterated rage being wrestled into submission. He unclipped the medal. The small click was the loudest sound in the room. He didn't look at it. He slid it carefully into the inner pocket of his suit jacket right next to his heart, where it belonged. He smoothed the lapel, his spine somehow seeming to grow even taller. He said nothing. 3 rows back, Lena Thorne watched her father. Her pen had stopped moving across her notepad. Her knuckles were white where she gripped it. A single sharp breath hitched in her throat, a tiny wounded sound that no one else heard. She didn't look at her father. Her furious, tear-filled eyes were burning a hole into the judge. Judge Finch leaned back, a flicker of satisfaction in his cold eyes. "You may proceed to the stand." Elias gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of obedience. It was a gesture of acknowledgement. He was marking the moment. He was not surrendering. He was remembering. And from the very back of the courtroom, a child's voice, clear as a bell, pierced the suffocating silence. "Mama, why did that man make the grandpa take his medal off?" The mother shushed her child. Her face flushed with embarrassment. Her eyes locked forward. The gallery shuffled uncomfortably. They had just witnessed a public stripping a quiet, procedural violence that left a stain on everyone present. Elias remained still, his back to the child. But those in the front row saw his shoulders fall and rise, once in a deep, controlled exhale. He hadn't come here to be the center of attention. He was here to testify for Corporal David Chen, a young soldier whose life and career were being systematically dismantled by the very institution he had served. He had come to be a voice for a man who had none. But before he could utter a single word, he had been put in his place. He had been told that in this room, his legacy was worthless. This was Judge Finch's kingdom, and in his kingdom, sacrifice did not command respect. It invited dismissal. But Judge Finch didn't know who he was dealing with. He didn't know that the quiet way Elias Thorne had pocketed that medal wasn't an act of submission. It was an act of war. It was the calm before the storm. Because Elias had learned a long time ago that the loudest response to disrespect isn't shouting. It's letting the whole world see the aggressor for exactly who they are. The clerk called him to the stand, and Elias moved with the same unhurried grace. The medal was gone from his chest, but the way he carried himself, the sheer force of his dignity, made it feel as though it was still there, burning brighter than ever. He took the oath, his voice a low, steady baritone that filled the space left by the judge's shrill command. He sat down. To look at him, you would never know he had been so thoroughly dishonored just moments before. Across the room, Corporal David Chen, a young Asian-American man with haunted eyes, watched him. Chen's hands were clenched in his lap, the only sign of the turmoil raging inside him. When Elias met his gaze, an unspoken message passed between them. "I am here. You are not alone." I first laid eyes on Corporal Chen in the spring of 2011. Elias began, his voice calm and resonant. "We were in the Tangi Valley, Afghanistan, a place where the ground itself wants to kill you." He paused, letting the memory settle in the room. His patrol was hit by a command-detonated IED. The blast threw their MAT-V 20 feet. When we got to the wreckage, it was on fire. Chen was inside, pinned under the radio console with a compound fracture in his femur and shrapnel in his chest. Elias took a slow breath. I was the one who pulled him out. I used my own belt as a tourniquet on his leg and packed his chest wound with gauze from my medkit. We waited 78 minutes for the dust-off helicopter. He was barely breathing when they lifted him out. But he survived. That is why I am here. Judge Finch shifted his expression a mask of bored impatience. "Mr. Thorne," he interjected the title, a deliberate insult. "Were you a certified surgeon at that time?" Elias turned his head slowly. "No, Your Honor." "A paramedic, then? A combat medic with official medical credentials?" "No, sir. I was his commanding officer." Finch let out a theatrical sigh, a puff of condescension. "Then your account of Corporal Chen's injuries is by the standards of this court hearsay. Your recollections are sentimental, but legally worthless. You are not a doctor." A chilling silence fell. It wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Elias said, his voice dangerously calm. "I didn't need a degree to know he was dying. I just needed my eyes. I didn't diagnose him. I stopped the bleeding." At the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Crane stood up. She was a woman in her 40s who mirrored the judge's cold ambition, her sharp suit, a kind of armor. "Let's be clear, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy as she approached the stand. "You are not a medical expert. You are here to provide atmosphere, a dramatic backstory." Elias Thorne didn't even blink. "I am here," he said, his voice dropping, forcing everyone to lean in, as the man who kept his hand pressed over a hole in a boy's chest for over an hour. "I'm here because I remember the smell of burning diesel and blood, and I know which one was his. I'm here because I was there." Crane gave a small dismissive smirk to the jury. "That's all very cinematic, sir. But this is a court of law, not a movie set." A few jurors chuckled nervously. Elias's hands, which had been resting on the witness stand, folded into fists. It was a small, tight movement, but it silenced the room again. When he spoke, his voice was different. It was laced with something ancient and unbreakable. "I didn't save his life with a certificate, counselor," he said, looking directly at her. "I saved it with my hands." The words didn't boom. They landed. They stayed in the air, heavy and solid, irrefutable. Lena closed her eyes, a fresh wave of tears threatening. She had heard her father speak publicly many times, but never like this. It wasn't the anger of a wronged man. It was the profound, unshakable certainty of a man who knew his own worth, even when the world tried to deny it. It was like watching someone walk through a furnace and not even smell of smoke. Corporal Chen's jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle jumped. He had carried the shame of these accusations for months, the whispers that he was a fraud, a malingerer. And in one sentence, Elias Thorne had lifted that burden from his shoulders. In the back row, an old white veteran, a pin indicating service in Vietnam on his worn blazer, leaned forward and gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of profound respect, an echo from another war, another time, but the same fight. Judge Finch, however, was a fortress of indifference. He tapped his pen on his blotter. "Continue with your irrelevant questions, Ms. Crane." The prosecutor returned to her table, but the atmosphere had changed. A young reporter in the gallery was typing furiously, her face impassive but her fingers flying. At the top of her screen in bold letters were Elias's words, "I didn't save lives with a certificate. I saved them with my hands." The proceedings ground on, but something fundamental had shifted. A man's character had been put on trial, and it was the court that was being found wanting. During the next recess, Elias stood in the hallway, the invisible weight of the morning pressing down on him. He held a color photograph he'd printed from his own files. It was grainy, taken in the chaotic aftermath of the ambush, but the image was harrowing. A younger Corporal Chen, unconscious, his uniform shredded and stained dark with blood. Kneeling over him was a younger Elias, his face a mask of fierce concentration, his hands gripping a makeshift tourniquet. When the court resumed, he presented it. "This is Corporal David Chentangi Valley. May 18th, 2011, Elias stated, his voice ringing with authority. "I don't need a medical degree to interpret this image. I took it with my own memory." He walked toward the bench, holding the photo for the judge to see. Judge Finch gave it a contemptuous glance. He didn't take it. "Evidence that has not been entered into discovery is inadmissible, Mr. Thorne. It's irrelevant." Then, with a flick of his wrist, he backhanded the photograph out of Elias's hand. The full I6 print fluttered through the air a wounded bird and landed face up on the cold marble floor. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Time seemed to stop. Then, heavy, deliberate footsteps. The bailiff, a burly white man with a bulldog jaw and a perpetually bored expression, walked directly across the floor. He didn't swerve. He didn't hesitate. His polished black boot came down squarely on the photograph, grinding the image of the bleeding soldier and his rescuer into the floor. He didn't break stride, didn't look down, as if crushing a piece of someone's soul was as routine as walking down a hall. Lena's hand shot to her mouth. Then her fingers, trembling with a cold, precise fury, found her phone. She angled it down, capturing the image, the scuffed photograph of her father's heroism lying beneath the boot of the court's authority. She typed with a speed born of pure adrenaline. They said his memory wasn't evidence. Then they stepped on it, literally. This is what justice looks like in Judge Alistair Finch's courtroom in Birmingham, Alabama. The man in the photo is my father, Rhett, General Elias Thorne. She attached the picture. Hashtag Orchard of Truth underfoot. She hit post. Elias bent down, his movements slow and pained, as if his own bones were protesting the indignity. He picked up the marred photograph. He didn't try to wipe the footprint away. He simply gazed at it for a long second, then folded it with ceremonial care and placed it back in his inner pocket, a wounded thing returning to his heart. He straightened up and faced the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "that photograph was not for you, it was for the truth, and the truth doesn't need your permission to exist." Finch's jaw tightened. For the first time, a crack appeared in his icy facade. A flash of pure, unadulterated rage, maybe mixed with the hot shame of being called out. He slammed his gaze toward the prosecutor. "Move on, counselor." But the world had already moved on without him. Lena's post was exploding. A retired master sergeant in San Diego shared it. "That's General Thorne. He pulled my best friend out of a burning Bradley in Iraq. This is a disgrace." A Gold Star mother in Ohio reposted it. "This man personally delivered the letter about my son. He knelt on my porch and cried with me. How dare they?" Then a national news correspondent who followed veteran affairs retweeted it to her 2 million followers. Shocking photo surfaces of decorated General Elias Thorne's testimony being physically desecrated in an Alabama courtroom. The Pentagon has yet to comment. The internet was no longer just watching. It was mobilizing. Outside the courthouse, a single man appeared on the steps. He wore a simple windbreaker and jeans, but on the collar was a small, unmistakable pin, the insignia of the 101st Airborne Division. He just stood there facing the building, a silent sentinel. 10 minutes later, 2 more men joined him, one black, one white, both with the quiet, squared shoulders of lifelong soldiers. Within the hour, there were 30. No signs. No chance. Just a silent, spreading line of men who had answered a call that no one had officially made. They were a wall of memory, a quiet guard of honor. Back inside, the bailiff, looking flustered, leaned over to the judge. "Sir, there's a crowd forming." "Protesters?" Finch snapped, irritated. "No, sir, they're just standing. And, sir, they're all military." A new kind of silence settled over the room. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was the sound of respect, gathering like a storm cloud. Lena looked at her father, whose eyes were still fixed forward. He hadn't seen his phone. He didn't know what was happening, but he could feel it. The entire room could. The jury glanced nervously at each other, then toward the back of the room, then at the unmovable figure of Elias Thorne. The air itself had begun to testify on his behalf. Elias placed his palms flat on the witness stand, and in that simple gesture, he seemed to take ownership of the space. He wasn't a witness anymore. He was the standard. The judge's voice, when he finally spoke, was brittle. "This court finds the testimony of Mr. Thorne to be inadmissible. He lacks the professional standing to speak to the medical realities of Corporal Chen's case. Therefore, this court orders that Corporal Chen is to repay all disability benefits received." A woman in the back let out a strangled sob. Corporal Chen simply folded in on himself, his face crumbling. His lawyer scribbled on a notepad, avoiding his client's eyes. Elias Thorne stood up. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled every corner of that room, every heart, every guilty conscience. "Today, Judge," he said, the words echoing with the weight of history, "you didn't just deny a soldier his honor. You desecrated the very ground he bled on for this country." He took a step forward. "You question my qualifications. So let me ask you, Your Honor, where were you when that boy was screaming for his mother in a ditch half a world away? Where were you when I was using my own shirt to try and plug a hole in his lung? You sit behind that desk, wrapped in your robes and your rules, and you dare to call him a thief for surviving." He turned, not to the judge, but to the silent rows of veterans who had now filled the gallery. Their faces were a tapestry of American service, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, a silent, powerful rebuke to the narrow prejudice on the bench. "This man is not a liar," Elias declared, his voice thick with emotion. "He is a soldier. He lived, and for that, you punish him." "That is enough." Finch's voice cracked. "This court has made its ruling. This is not some battlefield rally." Elias took one more step, his eyes blazing. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "It's worse, because on the battlefield, at least we knew who the enemy was." The collective gasp was audible. Even the bailiff took an involuntary step back. Then, as Elias turned to leave the stand, one of the veterans in the back rose to his feet. Then another, and another. One by one, the quiet guard stood a forest of silent, unbending figures. They didn't clap. They didn't speak. They just stood. A silent, living monument to the truth the judge had tried to bury. And in their rising, Judge Alastair Finch finally looked up and saw the full scope of what he had done. He hadn't just insulted a man. He had declared war on a memory, and the ghosts had all come home to answer. Just as the judge, visibly shaken, was about to adjourn, a sharp, piercing ring cut through the tense atmosphere. It wasn't a cell phone. It was the red phone on the clerk's desk, the secure line that hadn't been used in years. Everyone froze. The clerk looked at the judge, her eyes wide with panic. It's the direct line, sir." Finch stared at it as if it were a coiled snake. He gave a jerky nod. The clerk answered her hand, trembling. She listened, her face paling. "Sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's for you. It's General Eva Rostova, from the Pentagon. If a bomb had gone off, the effect would have been less dramatic." Finch's face went from pale to ashen. "Put her on speaker," he croaked. The clerk pressed a button, and a new voice filled the room. It was female, calm, and carried the cold, clear authority of absolute command. "Am I speaking with Judge Alastair Finch?" This is he," Finch stammered. "General Eva Rostova, Joint Chiefs. I am calling regarding your ruling on Corporal David Chen, based on your dismissal of the testimony of retired General Elias Thorne. Let me be perfectly clear, Judge. When a man of General Thorne's stature is asked to testify by the Department of Defense, it is not a suggestion. It is a directive under the joint statutes of military and civilian judicial cooperation. We do not expect our decorated officers to be humiliated. We do not expect their service to be mocked. And we most certainly do not expect a judge to physically disrespect evidence of a soldier's sacrifice." Every word was a perfectly aimed shot. Finch sank back in his chair. "I served under General Thorne in Iraq, Judge." The voice continued, a new edge of ice in her tone. "I watched him lead his men from the front, while commanders, 10 years younger, were hiding in the green zone. I have a list here of his commendations. It includes 2 silver stars, a bronze star, with Valor 3 Purple Hearts, and the Distinguished Service Cross you ordered him to remove. That medal was awarded for his actions during a 3-day siege, in which he refused evacuation twice to stay with his wounded men, one of whom, I might add, was the father of Corporal David Chen, who died in his arms." A wave of shock rippled through the room. Chen looked up, his face a mask of stunned grief and revelation. Elias closed his eyes. "You may not respect the man, Judge." General Rostova's voice was now dangerously quiet. "But you will respect the uniform, and that uniform outranks every single person in your courtroom, including you. This call is being officially logged as part of a formal inquiry into your conduct. A review of your ruling and your career begins immediately." Click. The line went dead, but the silence it left was deafening. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then slowly, deliberately, Elias Thorne reached into his pocket. He pulled out the Distinguished Service Cross. He didn't look at the judge for permission. He looked at the rows of standing soldiers behind him. With steady hands, he pinned the medal back onto his chest, right over his heart. This time, no one smirked. No one coughed. The bailiff stared at the floor. The prosecutor looked away. Judge Finch watched his face a ruin as the authority in his own courtroom was dismantled, not by a shout, but by the quiet, undeniable weight of honor. He raised his gavel, then let his hand fall the wooden hammer, never making a sound. "This court," he said, his voice a ghost of what it had been, "is in recess, indefinitely." As he fled to his chambers, the men and women in the gallery remained standing, a silent, powerful honor guard for the man who had walked in as a witness and would walk out as a victor. The truth hadn't just been spoken, it had been restored. Some victories are not won with a gavel, but with the quiet courage to stand firm when the world demands you kneel. The story of Elias Thorne isn't just about one man's trial. It's a powerful reminder that true honor is not a medal you can pin on or take off. It is the character of the soul, and it cannot be dismissed or disrespected by prejudice. It endures. If this story reminded you what real strength looks like, please take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And make sure you subscribe to our channel for more true-to-life narratives that give voice to the voiceless. Your support allows us to continue bringing these vital stories to light. Thank you for listening, and thank you for remembering that some truths, no matter how hard people try to step on them, can never be crushed.